If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The town of Dry Willow lay still under the weight of a noon sun. Dust clung to the wooden boards of the saloon porch, and every creak of a chair carried in the silence. Eli Ward sat against a feed sack just outside the doorway, hat tipped low, hands resting loose on his knees. He had no drink in front of him, no cards, no company. His presence alone unsettled the locals, a man with no land, no work, and eyes that never softened. Eli had once been a rancher near the San Pedro. He had family once too, though nothing of it remained. After a flood took his brother's boy, the land dried up in more ways than one, and Eli never found it in himself to rebuild. He drifted since then, moving from town to town, keeping his words short and his load light. Staying anywhere longer than a few days always hurt more than leaving. Nita, the Apache woman, stood across the street, the hem of her faded skirt brushing against her boots. She was already marked as an outcast. Her own people had turned her away after she returned from captivity, scarred and branded. To the townsfolk, she was a reminder of things they preferred to ignore: raids, captivity, the uneasy line between white settlers and native lives. She lived on the edge of both worlds, unwanted in either. When she stepped onto the porch, all eyes followed. Nita's chest tightened with the weight of those stares. She had long grown used to them, but each one still carried the same sting: suspicion, judgment, disgust. Some days she ignored it. Some days it broke through. Today, she chose defiance. Eli didn't move when she crossed the porch. He saw her out of the corner of his eye, the scar at her temple, the rigid way she carried her shoulders. She walked directly toward him, and before anyone could guess her intent, she lowered herself and sat on his lap as if he were just another piece of porch furniture. The sound around them broke. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered inside the saloon. Men muttered under their breath. Someone laughed in disbelief. Nita felt her pulse hammer in her chest. The act had been reckless, half in jest, half to throw the stares back at them. She told herself she didn't care how they saw her, but her body betrayed her, her palms damp, her breath quick. She braced herself for Eli's anger. He could shove her off, curse her, humiliate her. Instead, he looked up, just once. His gray eyes were steady, unreadable. He didn't touch her. He didn't move. He simply let the moment sit, as heavy as the heat pressing down on the town. Nita rose before the silence turned unbearable. She straightened her skirt and met the stares of the men along the railing. Their expressions shifted from shock to something sharper: mockery, judgment. The deacon's finger jabbed in Eli's direction. Words cut through the air: indecent, shame, disgrace. Inside, the saloon owner barked that they should leave before they cost him business. The sheriff came a moment later, his patience worn thin by weeks of town gossip and the endless pressure to keep peace. He said only one thing: they had until sundown to be gone. Eli gathered his bedroll without a word. His jaw tightened, but no anger showed. He had been pushed out of places before, for debts, for silence, for reasons that didn't matter. This was another in a long line. Still, something in his chest burned colder than usual. He had done nothing. He had chosen nothing. Yet the town had judged him just the same. Nita picked up her sack and tightened the knife at her belt. She felt the shame pressing against her skin, but she forced herself not to let it show. If she faltered here, they would take more from her than she had left. By the time the sun tilted west, they walked side by side out of Dry Willow. No one followed. No one needed to. The punishment had already been carried out: exile, silence, and the weight of every whispered word left behind. Neither of them had planned to leave together. Neither of them wanted the other's company. Yet as they passed the last wash line and the road opened into scrub and empty hills, neither turned away. For Eli, it was easier not to be alone. For Nita, it was safer not to be alone. Survival was reason enough. But in the quiet that followed, both carried the same unspoken thought: a careless act, meant as nothing, had bound them in a way they could not undo. The first night out of Dry Willow found them in a shallow wash where the air was still and the brush gave little shelter. The ground smelled faintly of dust and creosote, and the only sound was the tired shuffle of their horses. Eli set down his bedroll with practiced motions, unstrapping his gear and stacking it neat, while Nita crouched near the fire pit left by other travelers. She checked the stones, making sure there were no scorpions or snakes hiding in the gaps. These were things the townsfolk didn't think about, but for her they were instinct. Eli gathered what dry sticks he could find and struck a match, the flame catching after a moment of stubborn silence. The light spread in a small circle, a reminder that in open country the night pressed close. He didn't say much, but Nita noticed how he worked, steady hands, deliberate choices. Nothing about him suggested carelessness. She wondered if that steadiness was born of loss, or if he had always been this way. She unwrapped her small sack, a strip of jerky, a worn cloth, and the knife she kept close. When she adjusted her skirt, Eli noticed a scrape on her thigh she'd taken stepping off the saloon porch. Without a word, he tore a strip from an old shirt tucked in his roll and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it. No one had offered her help in a long time. She cleaned the scrape with a bit of water and bound it tight, aware of his eyes, but also aware that he didn't press her with questions. That silence gave her room to breathe. Eli sat back and opened a small leather pouch. Inside was a single brass button, polished smooth by years of being turned in his fingers. He didn't offer an explanation, and Nita didn't ask, but she caught the flicker of grief in his face before he tucked it away again. To her, it looked like a piece of someone else's life, carried because letting go was impossible. When the fire steadied, she finally spoke. "You don't have to keep on with me. Folks will say worse if they see us together." Her voice was flat, but inside her chest a knot of fear pulled tight. Every place she had tried to stay had pushed her out sooner or later, even her own people after she returned from captivity with scars she hadn't chosen. She braced herself for Eli to agree, to say he'd be gone by morning. But Eli only nodded once. "Walking alone isn't safer." That was all. The words were plain, but they carried weight. For the first time since leaving the town, Nita let her shoulders ease a little. She realized he wasn't staying out of pity. He was staying because he saw it as practical, necessary. That was a kind of respect she hadn't felt in years. The night stretched quiet after that, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the soft movements of the horses cropping at sparse grass. Nita lay down with her back to the open land, Eli with his to the fire. It was not planned, but it gave each of them a sense of protection. Neither admitted it, but both felt the same thought before sleep closed in. They had been pushed together by judgment, yet here on the edge of the desert, the company of the other did not feel like punishment. It felt like a chance, fragile, uncertain, but a chance nonetheless. At first light, the desert was pale and quiet, the horizon blurred in dust and haze. Nita rose before Eli, already moving with careful steps as she checked the wash for tracks. She had lived too long on the edge of danger not to look for signs. Coyote prints, boot marks, anything unusual. When she returned, Eli was saddling his horse. He noticed the way she moved, alert, deliberate, and stored it away as another piece of who she was. He hadn't asked her past, but from the way she watched the land, he knew it was written on her bones. They rode in silence, hooves crunching over dry gravel until they reached a trading post called 3 Stones by late morning. It was little more than a single-room store with a lean-to stable, but it was the only place for miles where travelers could buy supplies. The walls were thick adobe, patched in places, and a line of horse skulls sat on the roof beam, meant to warn thieves. As they tied their mounts, Nita felt the eyes. A curtain moved inside the window. She had felt that stare all her life, the kind that stripped her down to what others thought she was. When they stepped inside, the owner greeted them with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. His wife stayed behind the curtain, watching. Eli asked for coffee, beans, and liniment. The owner fetched the goods, but set them on the counter like they carried disease. He doubled the price without blinking. Nita stiffened, ready to argue, But Eli placed the coins down slow and even, as though the man's insult didn't touch him. Nita studied him for a moment, curious. Was it patience, or was he too used to being treated like less than he was? A ranch hand wandered in, dusty and grinning. He bought salt and tossed a careless remark about Eli choosing poorly. Eli didn't rise to it. He only stepped aside so Nita could walk out first, and his calm unsettled the ranch hand more than anger would have. Nita felt heat in her chest. Not shame this time, but something close to relief. He hadn't let the insult touch her either. Outside, they led the horses to a small seep where water trickled through stone. As they waited, a boy of about 10 crept close, staring wide-eyed at Nita. He asked if she was the woman who had sat on a cowboy in Dry Willow. She froze, every muscle braced, but Eli answered for her. His voice was steady, without mockery. Sometimes a thing isn't what it looks like from a porch. The boy nodded, confused, then ran back toward the trading post. Later, when they were back on the trail, Nita finally spoke. "You didn't have to answer for me." Her tone was flat, but underneath she tested him, wanting to know if he thought of her as a burden. Eli glanced at her once, then back to the horizon. "Didn't answer for you. Just didn't like the question." The words settled between them heavier than silence. Nita thought of the brand still faint on her wrist from captivity, of the whispers from her people who called her tainted, and of the townsfolk who treated her like dirt. Nobody had ever drawn a line like that for her before, not as protection, but as simple fairness. By the time the sun dropped low, they camped near a ridge where mesquite offered thin shade. Eli rubbed down the horses, his movements slower now. Nita noticed him favoring his ribs, a stiffness in how he bent. She asked if he was hurt, and he shook his head, though she wasn't convinced. She didn't press. She knew too well what it meant to carry pain quietly. That night, as the fire burned low, she asked him why he stayed near her when it would have been easier to ride off. He thought a long time before answering. "Every town I've left, I told myself it was my choice. Truth is, folks never gave me the chance to stay. Maybe I just don't want to leave the way they expect me to anymore." Nita held his words close, though she said nothing. She realized what bound them wasn't only exile. It was the fact that neither of them had ever truly chosen their place. For the first time, sitting in the dim glow of the fire, she wondered if they might. The morning after 3 stones, the trail climbed into low hills where the sun baked the stone until it burned through their boots. The mesquite stood crooked and sparse, offering patches of shade too small to rest in. Nita rode ahead, scanning the land with the sharpness of someone who had learned that danger rarely announced itself. Eli followed steady, his jaw set tighter than usual. His ribs ached from a stumble he had taken 2 days earlier, though he hadn't spoken of it. He hid it well, but the careful way he sat his saddle betrayed him. By midday, they found a shallow draw with trickling water and stopped to rest the horses. Nita crouched near the seep, filling a canteen, her eyes shifting to Eli as he dismounted slower than before. She said nothing at first, but when he bent to check his gelding's hooves and winced, she stepped closer. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. Eli straightened, adjusting his coat, trying to wave it off. "Nothing that'll break me." She studied him, her expression firm. "You're not the only one who knows what it is to keep quiet about pain." The words hung between them, a reminder of her own scars, the ones that showed and the ones that didn't. Eli finally let out a breath and loosened the buttons of his shirt just enough for her to see the dark bruise spreading across his ribs. He waited for mockery or judgment, but she only shook her head and reached for the small tin of liniment they had bought at 3 stones. While he sat against a rock, she warmed the ointment in her palms and worked it into his side with steady pressure. Eli didn't speak. He focused on the rhythm of her hands, the rare closeness, and the simple fact that she treated his injury without hesitation. Pain eased little by little, replaced by a strange quiet that felt more like trust than anything else. Nita didn't remark on it either, though inside she felt something stir, an unfamiliar sense of being useful to someone who didn't look at her with suspicion. When she was done, Eli pulled his shirt back on, careful with each movement. "Thank you," he said plainly. It was the kind of gratitude that came from a man who rarely used words he didn't mean. Nita nodded, then shifted the subject, asking about the pouch she had seen him open by the fire. He hesitated, then untied it again, showing her the brass button. His voice was low, and even as he explained, it belonged to his brother's boy, who had drowned in a flood years back. The boy had been wearing his Sunday jacket, and Eli had kept the button ever since. The ranch had broken apart after that. Too much silence in the house, too many ghosts in the fields. Nita listened without interrupting. She understood loss that left no room for healing. She didn't tell him her own full story, how her people had refused her after captivity, how she carried the shame of scars that weren't hers to choose. But she did say, quietly, "I know what it is to be sent away from your own blood." Eli met her eyes for the first time that day, and in that look she saw recognition. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition. That night, they camped on a ridge where the air cooled fast after sundown. They laid their bedrolls the same as before. His turn to the fire, hers turn to the open land. But this time, it wasn't only habit. It was an agreement unspoken. He would guard one side, she the other. Before sleep, Eli's voice broke the stillness. "Every place I've left, I told myself I was only passing through. Truth is, I left before anyone could tell me to stay." Nita rolled on her back, staring up at the wide sky. She felt the truth of it, sharp and familiar. And I never had the chance to stay anywhere by choice. Always someone else's decision. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It held their shared weight, and something new that neither could name yet. For the first time, both of them realized they were not just surviving side by side. They were beginning to choose it. The next day, the land stretched open into rolling flats broken by scattered boulders, the kind of country where every sound carried. By late morning, the horses pricked their ears, uneasy, and Nita saw two riders approaching from the east. She slowed her mare, her face tightening. The beadwork on the reins, the way the men sat their ponies. It was clear they were Apache. They reined in a few yards away, their eyes fixed on Nita first, then on Eli. One of them spoke in their language, sharp and low. Eli didn't understand, but he caught the tone: rejection, accusation. Nita answered in the same tongue, her voice steady though her hands trembled against the saddle horn. They demanded to know why she rode with a white man, why she showed her face when she had brought shame by surviving captivity. They pointed at the faint scar near her temple, then at the burn mark on her wrist, reminders she couldn't hide. Nita listened, her throat tight, then answered in plain words Eli could understand. "I didn't ask to return. I will not bring shame to your fires again." The riders' faces hardened. Without another word, they turned and wheeled their ponies, vanishing into the stones with the same silence they had arrived in. Eli shifted in his saddle, uneasy at the tension he had witnessed, but not fully grasped. He asked nothing at first, but Nita spoke before he could. "Even my own people look at me and see only what was done to me, not who I am. To them, I am a scar that should be hidden." She swallowed hard, her jaw set. "You don't need to ride with me. You've seen now what follows." Eli pulled his hat lower, considering. The easy choice would be to separate, let her go her way while he went his. But he had learned something in the days since Dry Willow. Walking alone was not freedom, it was punishment. He looked at her and said simply, "I'll ride where the trail takes me. Right now, it runs beside you." The words were plain, but Nita felt them cut through the isolation she had carried for years. For the first time since her rejection, someone had spoken without fear or disgust. She nodded, hiding the relief that threatened to show. They pressed on until the sky clouded over and the light turned flat. At camp, Eli tended the horses while Nita gathered mesquite pods for the fire. As the coals burned low, she asked him why he hadn't looked at her with the same suspicion as others. He paused before answering. "People carry scars in different ways. How about mine? I know what it is when I see it." He didn't touch the pouch that held the brass button, but she noticed the way his hand hovered near it, as though the memory pressed close. Later, as the night wind rose, Nita lay awake longer than usual. She thought of the riders, of the finality in their eyes. She understood then that she truly had no people left. Not the tribe, not the towns, not the family she'd begged for work. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. Eli's presence beside the fire was quiet, but it was steady. In that steady silence, she realized she was beginning to believe something dangerous, that perhaps the two of them could build a place where neither had been wanted. When she finally closed her eyes, it wasn't with fear of the morning, but with a question she had never dared ask herself. What if they didn't just pass through this world as outcasts? What if they stayed? By afternoon, the sky changed. A wall of dust rose on the western horizon, stretching high until it seemed to swallow the sun. Nita noticed first. She slowed her mare and turned in the saddle, her eyes sharp. "Storm," she said. Eli followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. He had seen storms roll through the flats before, but this one was broad and fast, the kind that could strip a man down to nothing if he stayed in the open. They pushed the horses hard, scanning the ridges for shelter. The wind hit them before they found it, hot, dry, full of grit that stung their eyes and cut their skin raw. Nita pulled her scarf tight over her mouth, and Eli did the same, though each breath still carried dust. His ribs burned with every jolt of the saddle, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. He wasn't going to show weakness, not when survival demanded focus. At last, they spotted a jut of basalt rock that cut the wind enough to make a pocket of still air. They guided the horses in and tied them close. But as Eli dismounted, his boots slipped on loose grit. He hit the stone hard, the breath knocked from him. He doubled over, clutching his side, the bruise along his ribs screaming sharper than before. Nita dropped beside him, her hands steady though her heart hammered. She braced him upright, shielding his body with her own until the worst of the wind passed. Her mind raced. If his ribs were broken, they would slow, and slowing could mean death in this land. But she kept her voice calm. "Stay still. Breathe with me." Slowly, his breath returned, ragged but steady. She checked for swelling, for sharp edges under the skin. No break, only deep pain. Relief flickered through her chest, though she kept it hidden. When the storm finally thinned, the land looked stripped bare, the horizon blurred into a dull haze. They led the horses into the lee of the rocks and built a small fire. Nita cooked beans with cholla buds she had gathered earlier, the smell earthy and bitter but filling. Eli lay back on his bedroll, exhausted, and for once did not argue when she insisted he rest. As she rubbed the liniment into his ribs again, he spoke quietly. "I used to walk out of towns before anyone asked me to stay. It was easier that way, leaving before I could be left." He stared into the fire, his eyes hard but distant. Thought that was the only way to live. Nita's hands paused for a moment before she continued. She understood more than he knew. "I never stayed anywhere by choice. Every place I was sent away. Every person decided for me." She tied the tin shut and set it aside, her voice steady but low. "This is the first time the choice is mine." Their eyes met across the fire, neither speaking further. Eli felt the weight of her words, recognizing his own truth in them. For the first time since the ranch had fallen apart, he admitted to himself that leaving hadn't kept him safe. It had only kept him empty. And for Nita, the thought took root that she might no longer be a burden passed from one judgment to another. The fire burned low, the desert night pressing in close. They lay down in their bedrolls, backs turned as before, guarding opposite sides of the camp. But this time, it wasn't only habit or caution. It was a silent pact. He would keep her flank, she would keep his. In the quiet between them, there was something new, trust beginning to hold. The storm left the land scoured and silent. For 2 days, Eli and Nita rode without speaking much, both carrying the weight of what had passed. Eli's ribs mended slowly, each breath a reminder of his fragility, though he refused to slow their pace. Nita noticed the tightness in his movements, the stiffness when he mounted, but she let him keep his pride. What mattered was that they kept moving. On the 3rd day, the trail bent into a small valley where smoke lifted from a sagging chimney. A woman in a plain dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, worked a broken windlass over a well, 2 boys straining beside her. The rope frayed with each pull, the bucket scraping against the stone rim. Eli and Nita rode closer. The woman turned, wary at first, her hands tightening on the crank. But when she saw their faces, dust-streaked, tired, carrying no weapons raised, her stance softened. "You ride in peace?" she asked. Eli tipped his hat. "Only looking for water." The woman nodded and stepped aside. "Water we have, though the well's near given out." She eyed the frayed rope and the sagging beams with frustration. "If you've hands that can work, I'll pay in meat and coin. My name's May Turner. These are my boys." Nita dismounted first, steadying her mare before approaching the well. She tested the rope, the splintered wood. "This can be fixed," she said, certain. Eli joined her, looking over the structure with a practiced eye. His ranching years had given him skill with tools, with building and mending. "It'll hold if we reset the pins and brace the frame." May watched them, cautious but hopeful. "Then you've work if you want it. This place won't last without water." Eli agreed without hesitation. For once, the decision wasn't about drifting. It was about staying, at least for a while. Nita gave a small nod. She had seen the boys' thin arms, their hollow cheeks. They needed hands, and she could give that. 4 or 5 days they worked from first light until the sun slid behind the ridge. Eli cut new pins from mesquite, driving them steady into the frame. Nita patched the trough with clay and showed the older boy how to check the rope for fray. The younger one followed her like a shadow, curious but cautious. At first he stared at her scars too long, but when his mother scolded him, Nita only said, "A face is a story, not a warning." The boy lowered his eyes, but remembered her words. At night, they ate at May's table beneath a single lantern. The light cast a small, steady circle while the rest of the valley sank into darkness. For the first time in months, Nita sat inside 4 walls without fear of being told to leave. Eli, quiet as always, listened to May's boys chatter about calves and fences. The sound brought an ache he hadn't felt in years, the memory of a house once filled with the same noise. On the 6th day, a trail rider stopped for water. He recognized Eli and Nita, surprise flashing across his face. He had expected them dead, run off, or worse. Instead, he found them alive, working, and tied to a place that was slowly mending. He watched Eli steady a post while Nita braced it with her shoulder, their movements in sync. Without meaning to, he carried that image back toward Dry Willow, an image of 2 outcasts building something stronger than gossip. That night, after the boys were asleep, May poured each of them a tin cup of coffee. Her hands shook from exhaustion, but her voice was steady. "You both saved this place. I don't know how to thank you." Eli looked at Nita, then back at May. "Don't need thanks. Just needed work." But the truth, unspoken between them, was heavier. They hadn't just found work. They had found the first place where leaving wasn't demanded, the first place where staying felt possible. The quiet days of May Turner's ranch couldn't last forever. Word had already traveled. Outcasts had not only survived, but were working, earning trust. By mid-morning of the 7th day, 2 men rode up the valley trail. Dust clung to their coats, and their eyes carried the look of men who had come with purpose, not trade. They dismounted stiffly, rifles slung but not raised. Eli watched them from the fence line, Nita from the trough where she had been teaching the older boy to set a rope without fraying it. May stepped onto the porch, her jaw tight, her rifle propped casually against the doorframe but within reach. The men carried a folded paper. One of them, a wiry fellow with sunken eyes, read it aloud as if the words were iron. Eli Ward, charged with public indecency, to be returned to Dry Willow. Nita, by name, accused of the same offense. The other man said nothing, only kept his gaze fixed on Nita, the kind of stare she had endured too many times before, measuring, condemning, as though she were already guilty. Eli held out his hand. "Let me see it." The wiry man hesitated, then passed the paper over. Eli unfolded it slow, his eyes narrowing. The page had no county seal, no mark of law, just a shaky scrawl signed by the town deacon. He turned it once, then twice before handing it back. "This isn't law. It's talk written down." Nita stepped forward, her voice low but sharp. "If Dry Willow wants to accuse us, they can do it proper, with a sheriff's seal. Otherwise, it's nothing." She met the men's eyes without blinking. Inside, her chest burned with the old fear. What if Eli decided it wasn't worth the trouble? What if he let her stand alone against their judgment? But Eli stayed beside her, solid as stone. May's voice cut through the standoff. You've had your say. These two are working here, feeding my boys, fixing my well. If you want to drag them back, you'll step over me first. She lifted her rifle just enough to make her point. The men muttered, shifted, then finally swung back into their saddles. They left with the false paper tucked under an arm, dust rising behind them. When they were gone, Eli's jaw worked, his ribs aching from the tension. He looked at Nita. It doesn't end unless we end it. He turned to May. We'll ride to Dry Willow. Settle this with the sheriff. Nita's stomach tightened. Returning meant stepping back into the eyes that had cast her out, risking another public humiliation. But she knew if they didn't face it, the whispers would grow louder, and May's family would pay the price for sheltering them. She nodded once. I'll go with you. It started with me. It should end with me. Before dawn, they saddled the horses. May pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle of food into Nita's hands. You come back, she said, voice firm but heavy with worry. The boys clung to Nita's skirt, wide-eyed but silent. For a moment, Nita felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of being wanted, of being part of the table that waited for her return. She promised them she would. By late morning, they rode into Dry Willow. The streets were already hot, dust lifting in waves. People stopped to watch, whispers rising. Some faces held disgust, others curiosity. Eli dismounted outside the sheriff's office, the false charge folded in his hand. He walked inside with Nita close behind. The sheriff sat slouched behind his desk, the weight of his badge heavy. When Eli laid the paper down, the sheriff's eyes flicked over it, then up at them. His voice was weary. There was never a charge. The deacon pushed for it. The saloon owner backed him. They wanted a show to keep folks comfortable. Nita's fists clenched at her sides. And you let it spread. The sheriff met her eyes, not flinching. I won't deny it, but I'll set it right. He pulled out fresh paper, wrote with deliberate strokes, and pressed the seal hard into the page. It declared that no offense had been committed, that any man who claimed otherwise spoke against the law itself. He handed it across the desk to Eli. Outside, the crowd lingered, restless. Eli held the sealed paper high enough for all to see. It's done. Sheriff says so. Anyone saying different answers to him. The sheriff stepped into the doorway, his presence confirming the truth. The whispers faltered, some heads lowered. Nita stood beside Eli, her heart pounding but steady. For the first time since she had sat on him as a joke, she felt the weight shift. The shame was no longer theirs to carry. They mounted their horses and rode out without hurry. This time, no one told them to leave. The ride back from Dry Willow felt different than the ride in. The same faces that had once looked at them with scorn now carried hesitation, even respect. Some turned away, but others nodded faintly, as if acknowledging that the matter had been settled. The sealed paper Eli carried was more than ink. It was proof that the judgment once thrown on them no longer held. For Nita, each step of her mare's hooves against the packed earth felt like peeling off a layer of weight that had clung to her since the porch incident. For Eli, it was quieter inside his chest than it had been in years. They didn't rush leaving town. They stopped to buy flour, coffee, and bolts for May's gate. The storekeeper, who once had doubled the price, now counted the coins without adding insult. Nita noticed the shift and realized that gossip could be fought, but only if faced head-on. Still, she kept her head level, showing no triumph. She knew, too, well how quickly crowds change their minds. By late afternoon, they returned to Mays Valley. The boys ran to meet them, shouting with excitement. The older one announced proudly that the windlass hummed and the trough filled without a leak. The younger carried a piece of rope he had been practicing knots on, eager to show Nita. May stepped off the porch, relief plain on her face. You came back, she said, her voice softer than her usual tone. Nita answered, I said I would. That evening, May set out beans and cornbread. The table was crowded but warm, lit by the same lantern that had become their nightly sun. For the first time, Eli allowed himself to relax into the noise of children and the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. He caught Nita watching the scene with quiet eyes, and for a moment he thought she looked younger, as though the years of rejection had lifted just a little. Later, May spoke plainly. "If you two want to keep on here, there's land on the east pasture. A corner nobody's touched in years. I can sign a 50-year grazing lease for a fair price. It'll give you a home, not just a roof." Her offer hung in the air, more weighty than the sheriff's seal. Eli looked at Nita before answering. He had learned not to decide for her. "Would you stay?" he asked. His voice was simple, but in it lay everything, the question he had never been able to ask anywhere else. Nita turned to the pasture, the cottonwoods marking the line where water ran deep. She thought of the riders who had rejected her, of the towns that had cast her out, and of May's boys who had run to her without hesitation. She thought of Eli's ribs, still healing, and the way he had stood beside her in Dry Willow without wavering. "Yes," she said at last, "I would stay." Work began the next morning. For 2 weeks, they built a small one-room house with a stone base and plank walls chinked with clay. Eli cut beams steady with the patience of a man who had once built corrals, while Nita gathered brush and mud to seal the gaps. She carved a shelf for the leather pouch that held the brass button, a place where memory could be honored without being hidden. Eli tied her knife to a peg by the door, close enough for reach, but no longer clutched in her hand at every moment. In the evenings, they sat on the step together, watching the cattle drift back from the far grass in a slow line. The boys sometimes wandered over to ask questions about horses or to listen to Eli's quiet explanations about fence lines and rope. May, standing back, watched the change unfold. Two people who had come with nothing were shaping something lasting. For Eli, the house was more than shelter. It was the first place he had helped build since the flood that destroyed his family's ranch. For Nita, the walls were the first she had ever been welcome to raise. Both knew the past couldn't be erased, but for the first time, the future felt like something they could claim. The morning was clear, the air sharp after a night of light rain. Eli and Nita rode into Dry Willow dressed in clean shirts, the dust brushed from their coats. The town stirred slowly, doors creaking open, men setting out barrels, women sweeping porches. Whispers followed them, but this time the eyes that turned carried less venom. People had seen them come back once before with the sheriff's seal in hand. Now, there was no false charge, no scandal to fuel the crowd, only curiosity about why they had returned. Eli tied his gelding to the hitch rail outside the clerk's office. He paused long enough to look at Nita, giving her the chance to turn back. She didn't. Her spine was straight, her chin level. She had carried exile all her life. Walking through that door meant laying it down for good. Together, they stepped inside. The clerk, an older man with tired eyes, opened the marriage book without fuss. He didn't ask questions, didn't make remarks. He wrote their names where they belonged, handed them the pen. Eli signed first, his letters careful and plain. Nita followed, pressing hard enough to leave a groove in the page. The clerk stamped the seal with a steady hand and closed the book with a firm thud. That was all. No ceremony, no blessing. Just law made official. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the deacon stood across the street. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, but instead his gaze faltered and he turned away. The saloon owner, polishing a glass behind the bar, ducked his head and busied himself. The sheriff stood on the boardwalk, arms crossed, and gave a small nod of respect. Nothing more was needed. The town had seen enough to know the matter was finished. They rode back to May's Valley before dusk. The boys were waiting by the corral, and May had a table set outside with beans and a small pie. The younger boy admitted shyly he had burned the crust, but carried it to the table with pride. They ate together under the open sky, the cattle drifting in slow lines behind them. For the first time in many years, Nita felt what it was to sit at a table without feeling borrowed or temporary. After the meal, Eli went inside their small house and took down the leather pouch from the shelf. He opened it and set the brass button in Nita's palm. His voice was steady. The boy it belonged to was loved well and remembered well. I carried it because I couldn't lay him down. Maybe now it belongs here with us. Nita closed her fingers around it. She didn't promise to ease his grief. She knew better. But she said quietly, "This house will carry him too. Not as a weight, but as part of what holds." Eli gave a single nod, the lines of his face softening in a way she hadn't seen before. As the light thinned, Eli asked her one last question. "Do you want to keep your name, or take mine?" Nita thought carefully. "Both. One marks where I came from. The other marks where I stand now." Eli said, "Good," and nothing more. That was enough. They set 2 cups by the door for morning coffee, a habit they meant to keep. The horses stamped once in the corral, then settled. May and her boys walked back to their own house, lantern light bobbing in the dark. Inside their cabin, the fire burned low, throwing warm light across the rough-hewn walls they had built together. There were no questions left, no shame to defend, no judgment left unanswered. They had come through exile, storms, and lies, and what remained was a choice freely made. For the first time in their lives, neither of them was leaving. They had stayed, and staying had become their home.